Ladies and gentlemen, it is that time of year to talk about the year that was in movies. As you can tell by the title of this video, today we're going to be taking a look at my top 10. In the title, I'm going to put the top 10 worst movies of the year, but I'm going to be honest. I don't take pride in making this particular video. I don't want it to ever come across like I'm bashing these movies or like making fun of these movies. The reality is like the people that make movies are far more talented than I could ever be when it comes to this kind of stuff. So this is just to just kind of share the emotions I felt when I was watching these movies and to just kind of talk about the ones that didn't really click for me. Also, if I'm being totally honest, I didn't really watch any like bad movies this year. There are no movies on this list that I'm looking at that I think like, wow, that was a bad movie. I think a more like accurate title for this list would be top 10 most disappointing movies of 2022. Obviously, I'm going to title it top 10 worst because that's going to get a little bit more views, and I think a little bit more people will watch that. But this is really just like my top 10 most disappointing movies of the year. I'm not trying to, make fun of any of these movies. In fact, all of these movies had something that, I could take away positively from them. But these are going to be the top 10 most disappointing movies of 2022 for me. A few things I think it's important for you all to know before I read my list. In order to qualify for this list, the movie had to have come out in 2022, and I have to have seen it in 2022. So any movies that I watched this year that are from any other years, they do not qualify. Ultimately, I did end up watching, at the time of recording, 49 feature-length films this year. And so these are just going to be the 10 that, like I said earlier, didn't really click with me. Starting off with number 10, a movie that I thought was going to be a little bit better based on the cast and the vibe I got from the trailers. I thought it would be a movie I would enjoy much more, is Amsterdam. The cast of this movie really appealed to me. Christian Bale, John David Washington, and Margot Robbie are the leads. It's a well-made movie. The dialogue is good. The execution is fine. The acting is top tier. It was just the tone just didn't click for me. Honestly, I thought titling it Amsterdam was a little bit odd as well. Like they only spend maybe 10-15 minutes of the film in Amsterdam, and yet that's the only thing they talk about the whole movie. About 20 minutes into this movie, I predicted what the last shot of the movie would be because it seemed like that would be what they would go for, and I was right, and that I didn't enjoy that very much. So, ultimately, a lot of people will enjoy this movie. It's funny. It's supposedly based on a roughly true story, which again is kind of intriguing once you kind of know what it's about. But in the end, it just it didn't connect with me. So that's why Amsterdam is number 10 on my list. My next movie is one of those that was just straight to streaming. I think it was Netflix. I honestly can't even remember at this point. This movie was called Me Time. I'm not surprised if you haven't heard of this movie. Like I said, it was one of those hundreds of straight to streaming movies that come out every year that just kind of get lost in the pack. This movie had Kevin Hart and Mark Wahlberg, who as actors I tend to enjoy. I think Kevin Hart's usually pretty funny, even though he's always the same character, more or less, but he's found his niche, so I'm not going to, blame him for that. Mark Wahlberg has proven that he can be funny when paired with the right, other actors in the movie. And this is a comedy. Again, I'm not going to go too much into detail of the plot, but it just was one of those movies where, as soon as it's over, you're just kind of well, I watched it, and now I can't get that hour and a half back of my life. Again, there were some funny scenes. You could tell, though, that this had a pretty low budget. There were some questionable CGI and visual effects. And, in the end, it was just one of those movies where it's I'm never going to go back to watch this movie again. I'm probably, after I give you my review of it here, I'm probably never even going to think of it again. The next movie on my list is part of a prequel/spin-off series of films that I think is just a little bit too much for me. And that movie is Minions: The Rise of Gru. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, I really enjoy the Minions. I think they are one of the better parts of the Despicable Me series of films, but I think they work best when they are just sprinkled in and are kind of a B plot of a movie. I think when they are the focus of the movie, they can be just a little bit too much for me. And that was the case with the first Minions movie. I thought they were just a little bit too much. Again, that movie in general was fine, but the Minions were a little bit overbearing. And the same is true in this movie. And when you factor in that this now has to be an origin story for Gru, and you have the Minions, it's just kind of all over the place. Again, in general, I enjoy the Minions. There are moments in this movie that are generally funny, but the minions are just a little bit too much for me when they are the focus of the film. So that's why Minions Rise of Gru finds itself on my list. Okay, this next one is one that I didn't see in theaters. It got delayed many times. I knew it was going to be bad. Everyone knew it was going to be bad. And it was very disappointing. And that movie is Morbius. There's a scene in this movie where Jared Leto is joking with Matt Smith, who they're like friends in the movie. And Matt Smith is like, have you found a cure for your illness? And Jared Leto jokes and he's like, yeah, but it has to be on an open water. And then literally the next scene is like a ship in the ocean. And it says open water. And I was like, okay, well, that's great. That's the type of movie this is. It just a lot of stuff going on. This movie committed what I consider to be a pretty big sin, which is where it's not obvious that the climax is happening. And then when it's over and you realize that we're now in the falling action of the film, you're like, oh, that was the climax. I felt like there wasn't much of a buildup and the climax was kind of underwhelming. So anytime that happens in the film, I tend to not enjoy it as much. And that's been the case with a lot of the Sony, like Marvel movies. It happened with the Venom movies and now this movie as well. So I will say Matt Smith was actually pretty good. I'd say he was like the most enjoyable part of this movie, even though his character is basically just the evil version of Morbius. But yeah, anything you've heard about this movie is probably true. It's not awful, but it's not great. So that's why it's on my list. The next movie on my list is one of those classic video game to movie adaptations, which 90% of the time don't work out, and that film is Uncharted. Now, full disclosure, I never really played any of the Uncharted games. I did, I think, a little bit of the online multiplayer for Uncharted 2 or 3 on the PlayStation 3 many, many years ago, but I've never been like into the actual game. So I'm sure that if I had been more familiar with the lore, there may have been some little Easter eggs that may have like helped elevate it a little bit. But ultimately, this movie just had a lot of like weird things going on. There were scenes where characters would get pickpocketed and they're like, hey, she stole this from me. But like if you watch the scene back, that person, like there was no possible way they could have stolen it. It's just like it just hopped into their backpack or whatever. And then there was one really odd scene where like Tom Holland was hanging from a chandelier and like you can hear him talking, but his mouth doesn't move. And it's really obvious that they just like did that afterwards. They recorded his line afterwards. It was just a really, strange movie in those regards. It is entertaining. I'm not going to lie. Like it's a fun time at certain points. It just like there were certain things that bugged me about it. I will see a sequel if one gets made. I don't know how much money this one made. They do very clearly set it up for a sequel, but this one just didn't do it for me. So that's why it's on this list. These next two movies on my list are movies that, again, I'm not going to be surprised if people haven't heard of these movies. They're movies that I just kind of stumbled across. So the next one on my list is called Deep Water. This movie stars Ana de Armas and Ben Affleck as a married couple, but they sort of have an arrangement where Ana de Armas can like sleep with other men and Ben Affleck is kind of cool with it, but occasionally he may murder them and she's cool with that too. So it's a really odd tone of a movie. It's kind of like it's got some Gone Girl vibes, but it's also like melodramatic and it tries to be funny at certain points. Like some of their friends in the movie like make jokes about stuff and it tries to be funny. The tone was just kind of all over the place. I really like Ana de Armas as an actress. I think Ben Affleck, for as much fun as he gets made of, I think he's a good actor too. But this movie just tonally was all over the place, really inconsistent. And the story just was really odd as well for the tones that it was going for. So that's why Deep Water finds itself smack dab in the middle of my list. Number 4 on my list is another one which, again, most people probably have never heard of before. I don't even know if it's based on something. It may have been based on a book or something like that. It's called All the Old Knives. This movie is basically about two former like secret agent operatives who meet up at a restaurant under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and they talk about a mission several months ago that went horribly, horribly wrong, that got a bunch of people killed. And so half the movie is them just talking at the table, but then we also get like the story in flashbacks and we learn like what happened. It's just a boring movie. Chris Pine is in it, and then Thandui Newton, I think is her name, from what's that show on HBO? Westworld. They're like the two main leads, and their acting is fine. It just they're not given a lot to work with, especially in the scenes where they're just like sitting and talking. It's just again one of those really forgettable movies that as soon as I'm done talking about it here, I will probably never think of again. So All the Old Knives, number 4 on my most disappointing movies of the year. All right, we're into the top 3, and number 3 on my list is the third film in a series, the first 2 of which were also relatively disappointing, and that is going to be Fantastic Beasts: The Secrets of Dumbledore. I just had to pause and look up the title to make sure I got that subtitle right. So basically, here's my experience with the Fantastic Beasts movies. The first one I actually pretty much enjoyed. I thought the first one was good. The second one, when I went and saw it in the movie theater, I fell asleep for like the last half an hour or so. When I went to try to go and watch it on HBO Max, when it came on there, I fell asleep again right at the same point. I eventually finished it, so that kind of tells you how I felt about this one. Or that one, I should say. The third Fantastic Beasts I never saw in theaters. I learned my lesson that I just wasn't going to pay to go watch it in theaters. I knew it would come on streaming relatively soon. I watched it on HBO Max, and would you believe it? I fell asleep again. I had to rewind and, finish it, but it's just like they're doing too much with the Fantastic Beasts movies, in my opinion. There's a whole controversy now with Johnny Depp. His character got recast. I think Mads Mikkelsen is a great actor, but they've basically had 3 different actors be that character now, and it's just like starting to take a toll. They supposedly have 2 more movies left to make. I don't know if they've made enough money. It's just one of those series where I'm just kind of like, they did not need to make 5 of these movies. 1 probably would have sufficed, and I think they're running out of steam while trying to do too much. So that's why Fantastic Beasts: The Secrets of Dumbledore is my number 3 most disappointing movie of 2022. My second most disappointing movie of the year is also the third in a series of films that sort of serve as like a sequel, but also kind of a spin-off. The first one I thought was fine. The second one was pretty garbage, but set up a really intriguing sort of situation for this third one, which they then proceeded to do nothing with. And that film is Jurassic World Dominion. Yeah, like I just said, the second Jurassic World was a pretty garbage movie, but it did set up a really interesting scenario for this one, where you have genetically re-engineered dinosaurs now just out in the real world, interacting with human beings in modern society. That is a really cool concept to make a film out of, and they decided to make a movie about giant grasshoppers or cicadas or something. They pretty much did nothing with that concept. They instead went for like, they brought back previous characters for that nostalgia. They decided to focus on a completely different story and didn't really do anything with like, hey, let's talk about what would happen if dinosaurs came back and were in the real world. They did absolutely nothing with that. It's still like a relatively entertaining movie. I mean, the Jurassic Park movies in general, like the action sequences are pretty exciting. From a visual standpoint, the effects are always pretty great, whether they're digital or practical. In that aspect, this movie is pretty solid, but they just did nothing with a really interesting concept, and that's why this movie is my number 2 most disappointing movie of the year. All right, we made it. Down to number 1, my most disappointing movie of the year. And this is not a movie that when I watched it, I thought would be on this list. But as the year went on and as I've been doing some reflecting, I realized how much of nothing I felt about this movie. And it's really disappointing because I don't think a lot of people watched it. Again, this is going to be one, it wasn't like a big studio release. It went straight to streaming. And I feel really bad that it's my most disappointing movie of the year, but I want to be honest. My emotions are telling me that this was the most disappointing movie I saw this year, and that movie is called Apollo 10.5. So basically, here's the deal with this movie. This movie is directed by Richard Linklater. It's an animated film. And Richard Linklater, if you look up his filmography, he's done some pretty big, he's been involved in some pretty big projects. This movie, about 10 minutes into the film, you realize it's just Richard Linklater reliving his early childhood in the 60s in animated form. It's literally just a narrator, who is the child as a main character, based on Richard Linklater, just recounting memories of growing up in the 1960s. There is a weird added component where this child is also asked to go to the moon, which I won't even get into that because that is actually kind of a spoiler how that plot point turns out. But it is pretty much just a way for Richard Linklater to relive the nostalgia of growing up in the 1960s, which I get. Like, there's something to be said about just the experience of growing up. Me growing up in the 90s, there were some things that I could connect with, like hanging outside with friends all the time, riding your bikes around the neighborhood, like those types of things I could connect with. But most of this movie was so specifically tied to 1960s things that I just could not connect to this movie. Again, there were some connections I can make to just like growing up in general, but if you're not from the 60s, if you didn't grow up in the 60s, I think it will be hard for you to connect with this movie because it is so specific. And again, I'm not going to fault Richard Linklater for making this movie. Like, it's executed well. The animation is very unique. The way it's presented is pretty cool. There is an interesting actually plot twist at the end, but most of the movie is just him telling stories of his youth. There really isn't much of a plot to follow. There's like no stakes. It's just like you're listening to like your grandpa tell stories of his childhood, which again, there's no problem with that. It just doesn't do it for me when it comes to movies. So it doesn't bring me any joy to say that Apollo 10.5 was my most disappointing movie of the year. All right, there we go. My top 10 most disappointing movies of the year. There were movies that came out this year that maybe would have made the list that I didn't see. I tried to make an effort this year to just not watch random movies. I really tried to limit it to movies that I thought I would enjoy, which is why, again, none of these movies were like bad. There were things to be enjoyed for all of them, but they were the disappointing movies that I watched this year. As always, this is objective. If you saw movies that you thought were disappointing that weren't on my list, maybe I saw them, but I liked them. Maybe I just didn't saw them. Maybe we can start a conversation in the comments down below. But with all that being said, I think we'll end the video here. Please be sure to be on the lookout on the channel in the next couple days, where I will be posting my top 10 best movies of the year. Thank you all so much for watching, and be sure to stay tuned for more.